I'm going to say something that I think you already know, but you may not know why it is the way it is. The heart of the comic book industry is being eaten alive from the inside by executives who prioritize vanity and optics over profit, revenue, and stability. We have some data here that confirms Diamond Comic Distributors is still running Free Comic Book Day at about a $20,000 per year loss, while struggling under bankruptcy debt that is $50 million and more, some estimates as high as $100 million. That's pretty crazy. Now, this video isn't going to be talking about Diamond's failing. I mean, that information is pretty public at this point, and honestly, it's just bad after bad and just ugly no matter how you look at it. But the real crisis is that executives at Marvel and DC are treating their comic departments as disposable IP pitch decks for streaming, for film, for other media platforms, instead of focusing on making the best comic possible. They're not focusing on creating a sustainable, profitable business. So stick around for some of the data points, but also some of the opinions as well. And I think by the end, you're going to see at least over half of one major publisher's output is actively losing the money because of this boneheaded strategy. So welcome back to the channel. And we're talking about the, I would say, toxic relationship between the big comic publishers and their association with Diamond and the fallout from Diamond's bankruptcy. Not a new topic, but there's a little bit more of a nuance here that I think is worth capturing. The distributor, in this case Diamond, is about $50 to $100 million in debt. That ain't small potatoes. And the bigger publishers are flooding the market with low-value, high-cost event books like One World Under Doom that just aren't capturing anybody's attention, building any hype or buzz. When you put those things together, you create a death spiral for the local comic book shop. Even though Marvel and DC have now moved on to other distributors, a lot of the vestiges of the same distribution mentality remain. What's at the heart of this problem is gross mismanagement that damages consumer trust and directly risks the entire retailer network. The executives who should be stabilizing the ship are actively drilling holes in the hull of the ship, instead of turning it right side up, pointing it to the North Star and say, let's build something great. They're playing a lot of rinse and repeat, trying to squeeze every dollar out of the whales and the collectors without thinking about building the next generation of readers. But you really can't talk about this industry crisis without talking about the rot at the top of this toxic relationship. The next point we're going to cover changes everything you thought you knew about Disney and Warner Brothers' billion-dollar comic book machines, especially now that Warner Brothers is under threat of being acquired by Paramount. Let's start with the core problem that's really infecting this entire industry. It's this idea of using comics as an IP mining cycle. The primary goal isn't to create the best monthly comic you've ever read and to kind of build the dreams and the memories of a young adolescent boy or girl to say, yeah, I remember that comic and it was great. I had that feeling. If you're listening to this video, you probably had that same feeling as well. Well, the publishers aren't thinking about that anymore. Their entire focus is to create quick, splashy concepts. Things like reboots and new characters and universe-ending events that escalate the stakes so quickly that you can't even conceive of what's happening anymore. The whole point there is not to create memories, it's to create film and TV pitch decks that are immediately greenlit because they check all the boxes and they meet the four quadrants of young, old, male, female type of viewers. But before we get too much further, I want to ask you a quick question about this concept of an IP farm. If Marvel's comics department generated $0 in profits, now they are making some profit. It's not like they're going bankrupt tomorrow. That's not happening, and that's a lot of rumor mongering that's just not true. If Marvel Comics department generated $0 in profit, but created one concept comic that earned Disney $100 million on Disney Plus, however they choose to define tracking money on a streaming service you subscribe to, would their executives still be considered successful? Is the comic book medium really dead if that's the case? And is the IP pitch deck all that remains? What do you think? Leave a comment down below, drop your answers. I want to hear all about it, and I want to see if maybe we can come to the right conclusion together. All right, let's look at some of the data collected by an assortment of news sites. Some of them I trust a lot, some of them maybe not so much, especially if we're talking about, now in this case, Bleeding Cool. According to them, the average price of standard Marvel and DC comics has increased by over 17% in the last 5 years. That's a pretty hefty hike. This hike drastically outpaces core inflation while the page count and paper quality often decline. Now, page count can be a little bit dicey to try and figure out because some issues will be 20, 22 pages as a standard. Some will be higher, 24, 28%. But I can tell you with great certainty that Marvel Comics paper quality has dropped significantly over the last couple of years. They're basically half a step above newsprint paper, which is not great if you're paying a premium price on the cover. Publishers will claim that this price increase is necessary due to rising paper and shipping costs. Okay, there's some truth to that, and I'm not saying that's entirely wrong, but it misses the point. The higher price is simply funding a strategy of incompetence. When you have event fatigue, when you have canon that's basically thrown out the window every 6 months, when you have endless relaunches with titles that are changed from whatever number they're at currently to a new number one, both the exact same creative team continuing the exact same story, well, then you definitely have a quality problem. This is an executive decision to shift 100% of the risk onto the reader and the retailer without accepting any of the responsibility for the quality of the output. Now let's draw a little bit of a direct parallel to the 1990s comic crash, because some of the things that happened there and some of the conclusions that were drawn as a result of that crash have somehow repeated themselves. You know, they say history repeats itself if you're not paying attention. Well, that's definitely the case here. Industry veteran Jim Shooter laid out how executive meddling and short-term gimmickry, things like variant covers and speculative bubbles and lenticular covers and all kinds of flash bang, whiz bang stuff that gets people to invest in the comic as a collectible item instead of a medium for telling stories that you remember. All those gimmicks killed long-term value. We're seeing those exact same warning signs today, but with the added pressure of the streaming IP mandate, where the executives who own these publisher companies, like Warner Brothers, which is right now at risk of being bought out by Paramount potentially, like Marvel, which is owned by Disney, they're looking for the next story that they can translate into film rather than comics that are meant to tell stories that kids will love. Now, what's at the heart of this flaw? What makes this cycle of incompetence possible? One of the primary culprits, maybe the biggest primary culprit, is non-returnability. If a comic sells poorly, the retailer eats the cost, not the publisher. This lack of accountability is the secret engine that keeps the failed event machine turning at the executive level. They never pay for their mistakes. If the retailers buy the comic and the publishers get the revenue from the retailers buying the comic, the publishers see it as a win. But if the retailers can't sell that comic because it's garbage, well, then the retailers are left holding the bag. And that toxicity turns into a form of cancer that's eating away at the local comic shops on a daily basis. But because the executives within the publishers don't have to deal with returnability, by and large, there are some exceptions there, they just see the money coming in and are allowed to continue to fail upward and upward and upward. You can't be accountable if you never have to pay for your mistakes. All right, so if comic publishers are focusing on the wrong thing and they're not being held accountable, and the local comic shops are getting tons and tons and tons of cheap comics with bad stories that they can't sell and then they can't return, how do you fix that? Well, I mean, you have to look at some pragmatic solutions. Yelling at executives, it just isn't cut it. That's not going to work. I mean, I can rail on Jim Lee all day long. I can yell at Dan Buckley all day long, but that's not going to force them to change. There has to be a practical financial way out, and it starts with a successful comic line and defining what that looks like. And here's kind of the funny part about that. The solution isn't about more events. It's about discipline, constant renumberings, constant number ones, constant, gotcha events and crossovers that are meant to get people surprised and shocked. That doesn't cut it. Discipline is the key. So let's talk about how we fix that. We start with extreme focus. Executives need to stop the 55 title per month flood. That's not helping anybody, and all you're doing is creating junk that has to be weighted and sorted through. Focus on about maybe 10 core, high production value flagship titles with dedicated, long-running creative teams. Now, we're talking a lot about the big two, but this applies equally well for the smaller and mid-sized publishers like Dynamite, like IDW, like Image. If they are only putting out miniseries and one-off, one-shots, that's fine for a little bit, but it doesn't get readers hooked. It doesn't get shops hooked. It doesn't create loyalty. It doesn't create long-term value. The big two and the smaller and the mid-sized publishers need to focus on core titles that are high quality, that are the best of the best, and that they put out on a consistent basis. For example, a decade of Batman by Scott Snyder or sustained X-Men run like Hickman's Hoxpox. This builds reader trust and long-term collection value, making it a win for fans, retailers, and the publisher's backlist. But you would have to invest in those type of long-running, sustainable runs for that situation to work. And if you think that's just a matter of opinion, let's take a look at some surveys that are published for the retailers. SketchD consistently shows that the single greatest driver of new, sustained business is long-form, high-quality runs, not one-shot gimmicks. Readers buy relationships with characters, not events. But we've said this over and over again. If you want to build a fan being short for fanatic, you have to create an emotional connection between the reader and the comic that they're reading. If you're rebooting that character, constantly changing that character, constantly changing the storylines, shifting from a number of 50 to a number 1 with the same creative teams, you are not building an emotional connection. Once one is established, say somebody really loves Superman, as an example. You established an emotional connection between the reader and that version of Superman that's written by whatever writer happens to be doing a good job on that title. Well, when you pull that creator off because you need to do another crossover event, or you need to do a big event that changes the universe or reboot the universe or whatever you're doing, you break that emotional connection. Establishing that connection is hard. When you break it and try to get it back again, that's even harder. You have to establish an emotional connection between the reader and the comic they're reading and hold on to it for dear life. The retailer surveys prove that out. When people get hooked on something, capitalize on it. Don't mess with it. DC was particularly bad about this a couple of years ago when they started their New Dawn initiative, and then all of a sudden they broke everything that they were starting because they wanted to start some kind of night terrors event, which turned out to be awful. That is the worst case scenario. You never want to do that. Marvel is particularly bad about rebooting a title with the same creative teams but with a new numbering system. They did that for She-Hulk. Rainbow Rowell's version of She-Hulk was slice of life. Blech. Nobody was reading it. And what did they do? Instead of taking Rainbow Rowell off and starting again, but with a better focus on She-Hulk's traditional fan base, they just rebooted to a number 1, but kept going with the same story. It makes no sense. So both publishers are at fault for this when we're talking about the big two. So we talked about extreme focus. Let's talk about the second solution. Hire creators who prioritize the medium. Executives must empower creators whose goal is to make the best comic book possible and do that first, not as a storyboard factory for a movie pitch. This requires insulating the creative department from the IP mining pressures of the parent company. It's undeniable that Disney is going to try and put pressure on Marvel to try and create something that they could convert into a Disney Plus show or a film. That's going to happen. But the executives at the top have to prioritize shielding their creators from that interference. The same thing goes with Disney and Warner Brothers Discovery. They are going to get pressure because now James Gunn has sort of created a new DC universe with the films. They have to protect the creators from that kind of influence and interference. Let's take a look at some publishers who do create that barrier of protection, maybe doing it in different ways, but with the same net result that is positive. For example, we're going to take Image. They succeed because creators have skin in the game. When you own your own IP, you are financially incentivized to maintain quality and avoid gimmickry because your long-term success depends on it. This is the model the major publishers need to emulate internally. So for example, if we go to Image, you have Spawn. You have some of the series that are being written by creators like Rick Remender, who does The Sacrifices, which I think is one of the best indie fantasy comics out there. But you also have like the licensed IP that's coming from Skybound through Image, like Transformers and G.I. Joe. They're focusing on making the best stories possible, and they're succeeding by putting out some of the best stories possible. They're also doing that with Ghost Machine, Jeff Johns' consortium of creators who put out things like Hyde Street and Rook Exodus. That's great stuff, but it's great stuff because they're incentivized to make the best stuff possible. And we can see how that pays off in some of the sales stats, at least the best that we can surmise from recent stuff coming out of ICV2 and Circana data. So if we look at Q3 of 2025, which was just a couple weeks ago, Marvel's total market share in dollars was 38%, but their share of individual titles published that quarter was 55%. So they're responsible for over half the stuff that's on the shelves, and yet they only have a little over the third of the market share, which means they've got a lot of junk out there that nobody wants. Over half of their executive mandated output is generating only a third of the revenue. I want you to think about that for a second. Over half is only generating a third. That's proof of a volume over value failure driven by reckless executive strategies. It's just not working. And that's why so much of the fatigue and the malaise that's setting in regarding the big two is directed at Marvel, because they are the market leader, and yet they're just flooding the shelves with junk that nobody wants. We have to pull that back. We have to rein that in, and we have to focus on quality over quantity. Marvel is not getting that message. Not yet, anyway. Okay, we started with Diamond, but this really turned into a rant against Marvel and DC, but with good reason, because combined, that entire environment is just a toxic mess. The takeaway in this case, I think, is pretty clear. Diamond's debt and the Free Comic Book Day losses are just symptoms. They're not the root cause of the problem. The real disease, the real rot at the heart of this, is executive mismanagement at the major publishers who chose to bleed the direct market dry and squeeze it for every dollar they can to service corporate IP farming. They're sacrificing the retailer network, which is the local comic shops, the very heart of the industry, at least now that the distribution is the way it is, and they're doing it for the sake of short-term gains. Now, if you think about the way the environment is laid out, the local comic shop is the front line. They are the entry point for a potential new reader, which is what's sorely lacking in this generation that's coming up. They're the ones taking the financial hit for every poorly performing event and every unnecessary relaunch. Our love for comics has to translate into action that supports the system, or the system dies. It's a battle for the soul of the medium, and it's being fought against greedy executives who are prioritizing streaming shows and films over the love for the medium itself. Now, if you're like me and you kind of have the same feeling about this, don't just complain about event fatigue online. That's nice, and maybe that'll get you a little attention, a few clicks here and there, but that's not the way to go about fixing this problem. The only way to send a message to these executives is with your dollar. Go down to your local comic shop this week, today if you can, and pick up one single ongoing non-event title. And I think DC needs it now more than Marvel. And do that from a publisher you trust. Now, do you trust DC? Well, it's up to you. But if you're going to do it today. Make your dollar a vote for long-form quality over corporate bloat and IP mismanagement. So hopefully you found this little semi-rant helpful. We've got some data. We've got some reports. Intuitively, I think we know all this. But as readers and lovers of comics, it's on us to support good comics where we can. And if you want to support this channel and help us do more videos like this one, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, click the bell for notification, and leave me a comment down below about that question I asked earlier. If Marvel made no money today, but the idea that came out in the comic, because even if it was a good or a bad one, generated $100 million for them in film and streaming, is it still successful? Do you count that as a win? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Now, go read comics, but read wisely. I'll see you next time for more comical opinions.